Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Vina of Moor Insights and Strategy, and welcome to the SmartTechCheck podcast, where we cover all tech topics that are smart home, home automation, home security, and console gaming related. Today is Friday, August 14th, 2020. I hope all of you are planning to have a great weekend. In today's podcast, I'd like to spend some time on the topic of trust, particularly in these uncertain and in some ways random times. It's an important topic for technology marketers to consider, as individual perceptions are so incredibly important as it drives their receptibility to different products and services. For a robust discussion on that topic, I'm pleased to introduce Margot Edelman, the Senior Vice President of Edelman, one of the great communication firms in the world. Margot leads Edelman's technology practice, and she's here to talk about the company's well-known Trust Barometer, a tool that they use to measure how governments, businesses, and the media are trusted by people, particularly in context of the big social and macroeconomic topics of the day. Margot, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Excited to be on again.
Oh, I'm glad you to be here. You know, we met, oh my God, it was about 2 years ago, year and a half ago. It was not,
but it feels like a really long time ago now. It was when everyone was, still seeing each other in large groups. Which feels like a long time ago.
How have you been holding up during the pandemic?
It's in the beginning it was definitely a shock, but I think you just, like anything, you kind of get used to it and work from home. I think my team is really held up and works just as well remotely as in person. So I think all things considered, doing as well as can be given everything.
Well, this is really a great podcast to do because I'm just so fascinated to really kind of pick your brain on all these big topics that have surfaced, in light of your Trust Barometer, which we're going to get into in a few seconds, and how the pandemic has influenced and affected it. Because I'm sure we're going to get into that very, very quickly. But for the sake of the audience, tell us a bit about the Edelman Trust Barometer, what it is, what it does. You made a decision to do updates the mid-year this year, which is a bit unusual. But let's talk about what the tool does.
Sure. So the Trust Barometer looks at the state of trust in 4 key institutions. So that's business, government, media, and NGOs. January 2020 was actually the 20th year that we did this survey. So we have like a pretty robust data set at this point, and you can really see how the world events influence trust in these different institutions. So for example, post-financial crisis, there was a massive drop in trust in business, not surprisingly, given everything going on then. And we actually do the survey in, I think about 26 countries around the world, thousands of people surveyed, representative sample in each country. So it really gives, an amazing snapshot of the global state of trust each year. And then this year, just given, everything going on in the world, the fact that there were so many changes with the pandemic and then social unrest, we actually did an update that came out in May of the survey. We did it in 11 markets, so not the full 26, but 11 of what we considered the most important markets, whether China, India, US, Germany, France, et cetera, to look at how trust had changed in these key institutions given the pandemic and given everything going on. And we had some really interesting findings. For example, trust in government is significantly up almost everywhere except the United States, perhaps.
And I got to stop you there. That fascinates me because I assumed before I saw the data that would be true, but I didn't think it would be as dramatically true as the data kind of presents. So try to peel into that because I think that's something that I think the average person would not see as intuitive.
Well, I mean, obviously, given the extent to which really governments around the world were able to step up, they were able to, in a lot of ways, lead their countries and lead their people forward during this state of crisis. I think it does make a lot of sense that trust in government has risen. People have really been able to look to their governments to lead them forward, to provide information, to keep them updated on the state of the pandemic, to, in a lot of ways, in some countries, keep people employed. At least in the United States, give people unemployment benefits, things like that. However, in the US, I mean, just, it's not surprising, just given everything that's gone on, that the US government has not exactly engendered that same amount of trust. However, actually trust in local governments in the US has gone up. But that has just not been the case for the federal government.
At the federal level, exactly.
Exactly.
And you know, and we really should jump into the topic that is on people's mind, millions of people across the country, across the globe, and that's about job loss. I mean, job loss obviously has been a big topic. Talk a little bit about that in terms of how the data maps to that big issue.
Absolutely. So what's interesting is that fears of job loss are really nothing new. So what we found is sort of in the Trust Barometer for 2020 in January, it showed that 80% said they were worried about losing their job due to automation and globalization. And so we can see that this is a fear that's been impacting people, yes, this year, and, Trust Barometers in the past few years have shown the same thing, that there's this fear of technology and fear of automation due to the worries about job loss. However, the pandemic has only exacerbated that. So over half of the respondents this time said they were very worried about losing their job to the pandemic, and not being able to find a job after, which, if you look at least in the US, sort of the, state of unemployment, it makes sense that people are worried. That the data bears it out, and the people who've been most impacted are the ones who can least afford it, or they're the people who are service workers, who wait tables, who own small businesses. And so you can, see why they're so worried. So it's interesting. It's almost gone, the pandemic has just sort of exacerbated trends and fears that were already in place before, a lot of ways due to fears of technology.
Interesting. So it was not just a light switch. People just didn't get paranoid once the pandemic started.
No. I mean, I think, for good reason, they became paranoid during the pandemic because they saw what was going on. But these
Sure.
have been fears that people have had for a long time.
Now, the interesting thing is, and as it goes to some of the ways that, governments and institutions are trying to combat the pandemic is, with capabilities like contact tracing and the ability to, contain people who are infected and identify that so you avoid that area, or at least, at least there's some type of organized way of understanding where the hot spots are. And obviously that requires the exchange of personal data. And there's been a lot of people on both sides of that topic in terms of confidentiality and, what are they giving up? But let's talk about what the data really says in terms of the way people, I say consumers, but people in general feel about that topic in terms of their willingness to provide information in search of hopefully a problem that government can help facilitate.
Absolutely. Well, the data shows, I have it in front of me, that 61% of people globally say they're willing to give up more of their personal health and location tracking information to help contain the spread of the virus. So this is something that globally that people, have bought into. But then again, not surprisingly, it really breaks down by country. So in China, which obviously has, a very, very robust contact tracing system that every single person abides by, over 90% of the people say they're willing to do this. But then when you start looking at, other countries more in Western Europe or the United States, the data doesn't totally hold that out. So, for example, in the US, only 50% of people are, 53% are in Germany, even fewer than that are in France, for example. But then again, going back to the US versus the rest of the world, what has stood out is that, Western Europe, despite these fears, has really been able to, work to contain the pandemic, whether it's through manual contact tracing, like people writing their phone number down at coffee shops, whereas the US, just from looking at the data, really doesn't seem to have been able to do that. So it's interesting that, yes, of course, you're expecting, this type of willingness to give up data from China. But then even in markets where there's a little bit more skepticism, like the US or in Western Europe, Western European countries have been at least relatively successful in being able to still do contact tracing. And then in the US, we have not. So again, you can go back to our leadership maybe to figure out why that is.
Well, but let's dive just a little bit into that. And how is that from your perspective when instead of looking at it at a country level or a regional level, what about at a brand or a company level, like the Googles versus the Apples? Do you have any insight in terms of, some people feel, okay, I'm okay divulging that personal data, but I feel better about divulging it to a certain company versus another company. Can you provide any perspective on that?
That's definitely interesting. I mean, I don't know. I don't have, specific data that backs it up company by company, but it is interesting just to see, we do have data on how people have responded in terms of how tech companies overall have performed during the pandemic. And so what's interesting is that tech companies' employees actually feel that they did a good job, which makes sense. So tech companies were one of the first companies to say work from home. Like Microsoft, as soon as this, more cases, started in Seattle in March, they immediately were like work from home. Same with Facebook. And those companies have, really delayed going back to the office. All of them have sort of pushed out any type of return to work to 2021. However, what's interesting also is that people don't necessarily think that tech CEOs have done a great job of leading during the pandemic. So they've done a good job for their employees in terms of protecting their own employees, but they haven't necessarily demonstrated the public, or seen as demonstrating the public leadership that people would expect of companies of this stature during this time. And again, we did this survey earlier in the summer. So I know, Google and Apple, for example, have come out with their own technology around contact tracing. For example, Microsoft has come out with sort of a talent marketplace. So there are definitely ways in which, tech companies have stepped up over the past few months that might not necessarily be reflecting the data. But I did think it was interesting that people perceive them as kind of protecting their own employees, did a good job there, but not necessarily in leading by example.
Do you think that perception is driven in part only by the company's actions, or do you think part of that is the media? The media may portray certain companies, certain CEOs, certain organizations in a less than favorable light?
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, I think the media serves in some ways to, what's the right word? Exacerbate, maybe it's not the right word, but to almost highlight.
Sensationalize.
Exactly, highlight what companies are doing. So if they're doing something well, they're doing it really well. If they're not doing it well, they're doing it really badly. And so it almost, creates a kind of polarization, I think, around who's doing well and who's not, whether that's looking at government leadership or whether that's looking at company leadership. We do actually work with one company, or a couple companies that have, I think, done a great job in sort of leading during the pandemic. So one of them, for example, is Coursera, which when this, first hit, actually made all of its courses free online for people, just knowing that, online education was going to become increasingly important, especially given that people can't show up, in person. People have more time on their hands. So this was an opportunity for them to really provide education as a public good. And then secondly, they're actually partnering with local governments to provide Coursera courses instead of unemployment, as a part of unemployment benefits, which allows for retraining and learning new skills. So I think that's a really great example of a company that I think did a great job of taking its core product and then using it to lead during the pandemic. We work with another company. It's a startup. It's a C3 AI run by Tom Siebel, and something really interesting they did there was to partner with Microsoft to create something called and other research institutions called the Digital Transformation Institute. And as part of that, they actually gave millions of dollars in grants to researchers who were using AI as a tool to basically help research cures for the pandemic. So that's another way that I think companies have stepped up in very specific ways to put their best foot forward and try to do their part during the pandemic.
And interesting, in perusing the report, the topic that is really fascinating to me, and I want you to get your point of view on this, is that during the pandemic, and this, is that there's been a tremendous run up in technology sales as people, and we're going to get into the work from home topic in a moment, but as people have been kind of rushed to work at home, they've been upgrading their PCs or buying new notebooks. Yeah. You still can't find a notebook. Try to find a webcam. Good luck. I tried to buy a keyboard this morning online. 6-week wait for a Logitech keyboard from Amazon, and despite this rush in technology. And many of the tech companies actually have done quite well during the pandemic, and it's been a bit of a tailwind. Your data shows that the trust has deteriorated to a bit. Technology has deteriorated from a trust standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. For so long, technology has been the most trusted sector in business. Really for years and years. Mm-hmm. But what we have seen over the past, probably 3 to 4 years is we've seen that trust deteriorate. And so it used to be, way higher than business. And then over the years, trust in business overall has gone up slightly, and trust in tech has gone down. And there's been so many issues in the tech sector, whether that's issues around data and privacy, whether that's issues around potentially monopoly power like an Amazon could have, whether that's Facebook and fake news and all of that. There are so many ways that the tech sector and its leaders have been sort of at the forefront of potential issues in the country. Or going back to our original discussion, automation and displacement of people's jobs, all of that the tech sector is at the heart of. And so my hypothesis is all these issues have started to erode trust in the sector, because for a long time tech was my iPhone that lets me call my family or order an Uber, or order food, or it's my computer, and it's all these things and gadgets that are enhancing your life. But over the last few years, technology, just through the newspaper, has started to be associated with things that are negative, not just kind of the tools and products that are helping your life be better. And I think what the data shows here is just a little bit of a continuation of that. So the sectors that are doing the best are actually healthcare and then food and beverage. And those, at least when we did the survey back in May, were really the sectors that are at the forefront of the pandemic, right? Like the healthcare sector, you have, different, companies, trying to discover, a vaccine for COVID. You have, hospitals putting their, nurses and doctors on the line every day to save people's lives. And, no wonder trust in healthcare has gone up. That sector has, really been at the forefront of how we're going to combat what's going on. And then with food and beverage, it's sort of same thing. I mean, they're the ones who have kept our grocery stores stocked. They're the ones who've kept, supply chains open, all of that. And so, without that sector, the entire economy would collapse. And I think there were very much worries about that, going back to, March and April, that might be the case. And it hasn't been, partly because I think that sector has seriously kind of stepped up to keep plants open, to keep stores open, keep people safe, all of that. And so I think the tech sector, it's a combination of they haven't necessarily been on the front lines in the same way. And then there's also just been a general erosion of trust over the years due to all the issues we just talked about.
So what guidance would you provide to tech companies to really help build trust? I mean, we've talked about this before, even before the pandemic, but certainly it's probably more important now than ever. At a macro level, what are the 2-3 things that you think companies really should hammer home to help them build trust? Because it's so important, not just from a revenue and a margin and a profitability standpoint, but for building a brand that is long lasting and spans over decades of time, not just a few short periods of time.
Well, our data does show that people want companies, and in particular tech companies, to partner with government to create a solution for the pandemic. So people want tech companies to be stepping up and to be helping. Going back to the couple examples I had shared, I think the more tech companies can use their kind of core products and services and either make them free or make them available to frontline workers, things like that, I think the better off they'll be, and they'll start to kind of regain that halo of trust. Another thing that's interesting in the data, and I think tech companies are doing quite well, is to prioritize health and safety over anything else in return to work. So the important thing is not to make sure you have butts in seats and people are back, but that the people who are your employees are safe. And I think that's easy to do with white collar workers who sit at home and can easily work remotely. Likely sort of the same applies, if you're Amazon and you have warehouse workers, how are you keeping them safe? How are you prioritizing their health and safety? So it's not just about kind of the white collar workers that easily can sit behind a desk and do remote work. It's also how do you treat the employees who are on the front lines, and when do you bring them back, and how do you keep them safe? So I think those two things are incredibly important. And then I also do think, still going back to our original conversation, that people are looking to CEOs for leadership. So if tech company CEOs, they have a huge amount of visibility. They're being, hauled in front of Congress to talk about what their companies are doing. This is a time for them to sort of advocate for, ways that business and government can partner to improve the lives of workers today, just because we've been through so much change. And this is an opportunity for them to use their products and services to make a difference.
Now, in the few minutes we have left here, because it's a topic we have to talk about, is that, obviously we're in this kind of, unprecedented work from home behavioral pattern right now. And everybody's kind of waiting to see, is this going to change in a dramatic way? And if I talk to 20 people, I'll get 10 people that will tell me, work from home is here to stay. And I'll get 10 other people to tell me, things are going to go back to normal. Now, the data that you guys have show pretty clearly that people do want to see partnerships between business and governments to fix the problem. I think that's pretty clear. From your perspective, do you think that, from your personal experiences, from the clients that you interact with, the data that you have, do you really think that how is remote work going to change after the pandemic is over?
No, that's a very interesting question. I think one we're all grappling with is, for Edelman as a professional services firm, we have a massive amount of office space.
Yeah.
Do we need that? Do we need to have enough space for every single person? And is there the expectation there should be in the office? I think, as the data shows, we need to be incredibly careful about going back and, not go back before people are ready. And as I said, that applies, I think, yes, for white collar workers, but also for, those who are more on the front lines. How can we keep them safe? But then just in terms of remote work, I personally have asked, a number of, reporters this and from my friends, and I think there's just generally a feeling that we won't necessarily, that a lot of meetings that I think we thought needed to be in person, and we needed to be there physically, and we needed to make that flight to London to have that one meeting. I think there's maybe a feeling that that's not as necessary anymore, and that business can be effective just working remotely, seeing people over a screen, rather than needing to do all of this travel and all of this, flying back and forth, et cetera, to get to places. I think, people definitely are, now accustomed to working remotely, accustomed to having conversations and facilitating introductions over Zoom. And, I personally think that work is going to go more that way. And I also think, again, this is just something I've seen personally, like places like San Francisco, New York City, like they're incredibly expensive to live. And so, I think you can actually have a great team. And if people want to work remotely because they can afford a house better in the middle of the country, or they just want to have a better lifestyle out there rather than having to live in San Francisco or New York, I think they should have the option to do that. Like, I think, there are definitely benefits to having a team that's happy, having a team that feels that they can have, a place where they can live in a place where they can afford to buy a house and all of that. And so, at least for me personally, I'm now getting onto the distributed work bandwagon, because to me, as long as people are productive, they sign on when they should, they're, show up to meetings on Zoom, I'm like, great, that's all I need. So,
sure.
I think that will be here to stay too.
No, I think the point you made, that this is going to have a disruptive impact on things like property sales, property values, office space. No one really knows, of course, as you've mentioned, where the new normalcy is going to be, 3 or 4 months from now. Hopefully it's only 3 or 4 months. Hopefully it's sooner than that. But I think it's going to have a profound impact on, there's a lot of people who are going to be, hey, I enjoy working from home. I can potentially move to a different place that allows me to live with a better lifestyle from a financial standpoint, maybe close to other members of their family. So there's going to be lots and lots of interesting implications of it. And as a Bay Area guy myself, I like the fact that I can get on the highway at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, drive to San Francisco in 35 minutes versus an hour and a half. So totally. It's going to have impacts on that as well. Before we sign off, any other parting topics? And by the way, how do we get this report? Because this report is so incredibly interesting, and I know you're probably pitching it to everyone as you talk to all your clients about it. But how can someone get their hands on it?
Absolutely. All you need to do is go to edelman.com and just do 2020 Trust Barometer Spring Update, and it'll come right up with a full deck, infographics, and executive summary. So you'll have all of the information and data on the report just by doing that. So very easy to find. I just want to say, obviously we're living in unprecedented times, and in some ways it's actually incredibly exciting to see all the ways that technology are enabling connections when you can't see people in person. So I think in some ways, I'm actually very grateful that this happened when it did, in the sense that, if this happened 15 years ago, we wouldn't have an iPhone. We wouldn't have, a way to connect with everybody. So in some ways, you can say what you want about technology companies, et cetera, but technology has really enabled all of us to really stay connected at a time that's been, as you said, extremely uncertain and disjointed. So maybe end on that positive note.
To say the least, it's been uncertain.
Exactly.
But listen, Margot, thank you for joining me for today's podcast. For the Moor Insights and Strategy audience, please follow us on our usual social media partners, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And until next time, have a great weekend.